The reign of humans and that of the most dinosaur of post-Cretaceous dinosaurs overlapped in time significantly, but there's new evidence that suggests that perhaps it did in space as well. Terror birds terrorized not just South America, but also parts of North America, and humans, as recent discoveries suggest, were there a lot earlier than we thought. So what were they all doing down there, and did the two species come in contact with one another? In this video, we're looking at who these apex predators were that sat on the throne for over 30 million years, how truly scary they became during this time, and why they disappeared. And stick around because we'll discuss the plausibility of an ancient race of humans riding these beasts into war. Quite recently, in 2021, a paper was released that suggested humans could have been in North America as far back as 23,000 years ago. And not just up in the top bit, but all the way down at the bottom, where a set of footprints were analysed by researchers who claimed they appeared to date roughly that far back. This suggestion would shatter the previous assumption that humans arrived on that particular part of the world around 13,000 years ago, which was based on some very human-like spearheads that were used to kill mammoths in a place called Clovis, New Mexico. It's also how old these same footprints were presumed to have been before the new study came out. Such a wild assertion, though, took until even more recently to confirm, and in 2023 the very same researchers did just that. So in a blink of an eye, 10,000 years of missing history was exposed. This is pretty significant in a number of ways. First, it highlights just how little of prehistory is preserved, even as recently as this. And secondly, it opens up a span of time perhaps 10 times longer than the Clovis people were around, during which who knows what humans were doing. But thirdly, it also implies that the old assumption of human entry into South America could also be way off. Because why wouldn't they have made their way across the Isthmus of Panama if they were already present? Well, one of the main reasons for this might have been the enormous bipedal theropods that still roamed the forests and plains down there. Because around 20,000 years ago, South America still had terror birds. But regardless of whether those 23,000-year-old footprints followed our ancient people into South America, the very fact that they existed where and when they did is particularly exciting. Because perhaps even more stimulating to the imagination is the fact that there may have been North American terror birds around at that time too. And big ones. Before we go any further, let's do a quick recap on what terror birds were. For the longest time, around 30 million years, South America was so isolated from the rest of the world, it hadn't been occupied by anything but the animals it left with when it separated from Africa and Antarctica in the Eocene. This island continent was enormous and entirely unique. While much of the rest of the world was being colonized, the fauna of this island continent were often enormous and entirely unique. And while much of the rest of the world was being colonized by the new generation of super predators, South America had no cats, no dogs, no bears, and of course no humans, because they hadn't been invented yet. What it did have was a family of flightless avian theropods known as the Phorusrhacids, who had been running around killing things since before the breakup around 43 million years ago. The origin of these birds isn't clear, but it looks as though they could have been around in Antarctica and Africa too, so presumably they ranged across Pangaea to some extent. Regardless, they are best known for being the dominant predators across South America, and they held this title for tens of millions of years, at least on the land. It's worth giving a brief nod to the 14-meter caiman that occupied the epicontinental sea that formed when the Amazon River was blocked by the Andes 15 million years ago, but all of that is for another video. Anyway, in this time they diversified into most predator niches and they grew to enormous proportions. The largest of this group of so-called terror birds may have reached 500 kilograms in weight and stood 3 meters tall. Now, it's worth reiterating here that while we commonly say the dinosaurs died out 66 million years ago, in reality only most of them did. Birds are dinosaurs. And while the surviving birds immediately after the extinction event were generally pretty small, Not much time later, many branches of these theropods returned to the ground, lost their flight, and got much bigger, and they took over the roles of their extinct theropod cousins. And terror are a perfect example of this. The dominance of these birds in their ecosystems extended well into the late Pleistocene. Terror then were predatory bipedal theropod dinosaurs, dinosaurs that shared the Earth with humans. Let that sink in for a little while. And though all birds are technically bipedal theropod dinosaurs, not all birds are as tall as an Allosaurus. They may not have had quite the same mass of some of the Cretaceous theropods of the same height, but they were suitably doing their best, as evidenced by their 30 million year position at the top of the food chain. More than this, though, many, if not all, terror had the familiar sickle claw on one of their toes. The same sickle claw that Dr. Alan Grant scared that bratty little kid with at the beginning of Jurassic Park. The same sickle claw that was found embedded in the neck of a Protoceratops in the fighting dinosaurs fossil from Mongolia. And they were fast. It's theorized that the larger of the terror could run at around 48 kilometers an hour. And when it caught up to its prey, it had a piercing beak, much like that of an eagle, only substantially bigger, almost half a meter long. These incredible hunters were so good at what they did, they forced all of the native mammalian predators to skulk about in the forest and away from the prime open hunting grounds. So after just a brief hiatus in the wake of the asteroid, dinosaurs wouldn't be kept away for long, and in South America they became fairly diverse. Let's take a look at some examples. One of the longest-lasting genera in this family was Coelopterus, and this happened to be one of the smallest too. Coelopterus was a relatively tiny terror at around 80 centimeters tall and up to 9 kilograms in weight. Being this little, it certainly wasn't the apex predator of the time, and across its range there had become chunky toxodontid herbivores like A. Dinotherium and the 500 kilogram plus Nisodon, between whose feet the nippy little Coelopterus probably scurried. There were mammalian predators around too, like the toothy Borrhyena, and the much larger Proborrhyena, which grew to the size of a small bear. Yet even these weren't top predators. As we mentioned, terror held that position, and examples like Brontothornis and Kelenken are why. Kelenken was one of the tallest at around 3 meters, but it was relatively slim at just over 150 kilograms. Brontothornis, on the other hand, was one of the heaviest birds ever recorded, at around 400 kilograms. Now, Brontothornis' taxonomy has come into question of late, and it's still up for debate. Perhaps it wasn't the same family as the terror but the true nature of its lineage, while important in other contexts, doesn't matter too much here. The fact remains that while placental mammals were dominating almost all niches in the ecological sandbox of the post-Cretaceous world, the apex predators of South America until well into the Pleistocene were huge bipedal theropod dinosaurs. But even the dinosaurs' second wind would come to an end. Birds were simply incapable of competing against mammals in the top terrestrial niches, and when the land bridge formed between North America and the encroaching island continent, an influx of modern predators, bears, cats, wolves, and so on, spelled the beginning of the end for the terror But this didn't happen quickly, and while the vast majority of predatory migrants were coming into South America from the north, some of the more tenacious terror were adventuring into new lands in the opposite direction. Titanus walleri is one of the last terror known. It's also one of the largest, at up to 2 meters tall, and possibly as heavy as 300 kilograms. Its wings, while too small for flight, were robustly built, more so than we'd find in today's giant ratites like ostriches. And of course it had that terrifying beak that all terror are known for. What stands out about this genus, and just a small selection of others, was that it could be found well outside of South America as recently as the Pleistocene. When a volcanic ridge rose to connect the two continents, a multi-million-year exchange in animal life erupted too. This event did not bode well for the majority of large South American fauna, whose early encroachment into North America ended in failure in the vast majority of cases, and whose populations back home in the southern continent would come to be decimated by the far more competitive carnivorans descending into it. So Titanus represented a lasting stronghold for the South American Predator Guild long after the majority had gone extinct. It had not only successfully competed in South America against the marauding killers from the north for 1,000,000 years by this point, but it also migrated out of South America and made it as far as Texas, California, and Florida, where it stayed for quite a while there too. In fact, researchers once had Titanus pegged as surviving well into the late Pleistocene, up to perhaps 15,000 years ago, which, as we now know, was at least 8,000 years into the human presence in the same part of the world. So could the two species have interacted with one another? And if so, what would that have looked like? We're about to deviate from what's known and explore the fun and fact-free world of speculation. While there's currently no evidence for such an event, we're going to imagine a setting where humans and terror birds interacted with one another directly, and we'll wonder about which ways this might have gone. But before we do, here's a quick thank you for getting this far into the video, and a reminder to please give it a like if you deem it worthy. Every subscriber, like, comment, and share helps us build momentum, so thanks again for all of that. But enough of that, let's talk pet terror birds. Did prehistoric humans form a mutualistic arrangement with Titanus and use them to run about the lands harpooning giant sloths for barbecues? Science can't count it out. But from the evidence so far, this particular example might be a little out there. Reanalysis of Titanus fossils, for one thing, brought the date of their presence in North America back to at least 1.8 million years, which, given how long 1,000,000 years is also 1.8 million years earlier than those earliest human footprints. Foiled again. But this was only Titanus. What about other genera? That petite version of a terror bird that we mentioned, Scilopterus, was found to have shared its final resting place with the so-called long llama, Macrauchenia, when both were dug up from the same strata in Uruguay. And one of this extinct ungulate's leg bones has been carbon dated to around 22,000 years ago. So now we're stretching things a little bit. Uruguay is way down south of South America, and this was perhaps one of the last of the terror birds, holding out in a remote spot maybe before finally succumbing to the same fate as its relatives. But remember again that a single set of footprints opened a vacuum of 10,000 years of human presence that is yet to be filled with any further evidence. This is how much of a lottery paleontology is. And with that in mind, it's important to consider the low likelihood that the earliest fossils we find are the earliest examples of their kind. So with humans being present in North America 23 years ago, and at least one terror bird being present in South America 22 years ago, the chances that one of the two species was in the habitat of the other at around the same time don't feel so far-fetched. But then, if they were, how would they have interacted? Well, looking at the history of human interactions with other animals, we could safely assume it was a one-sided massacre. But there are some exceptions to this. One type of predator that was powerful, smart, and complementary enough to end up joining forces with us did so tens of thousands of years ago. Wolves diverged from the ancestors of domestic dogs about 40,000 years ago. It's not certain when after that they became humans' best friends, but the earliest evidence we can find puts that date to at least 26,000 years ago in Siberia, and other domestication events likely happened elsewhere independently. So it's not too far beyond the realms of possibility that an early community of humans found a species that shared their smarts, their social intelligence, and their bloodlust, and ended up working together for a time. Birds are actually pretty well known for this sort of behavior. Honey guides are said to lead both honey badgers and humans to beehives to share the spoils of that massacre. Ravens lead wolves to carcasses with the same intent, and all sorts of birds on the African plains are known to help their mammalian herbivorous community members by alerting them to threats in exchange for easy access to food. So should the first humans to encounter terror birds avoid the temptation just to club them to death and steal their eggs, a mutualistic relationship could have been possible. And since we're in the realm of wild speculation, perhaps at some point long ago, this relationship became stable enough for a bold young human to slip gently onto its terror bird's back and ride it like an ostrich. And the rest, as they say, is prehistory. That's all for this video. We hope you've had fun. Please don't forget to give it a thumbs up, and we'll see you for the next one.